Welcome to Vices and Volumes, the podcast that brings forgotten stories from the 1800s back to life. I'm Avril, and each episode I dive into my collection of old books to uncover the fascinating tales, beliefs, and characteristics that shaped our past. From forgotten ghost stories to social customs, from scientific curiosities to supernatural folklore. If it's tucked away in these pages of history, I'm going to share them with you. In this episode, we're diving into the art of conversation, Victorian lady style. And by art, I mean the art of not speaking. While the chapter that inspired this is titled Conversation, what Matilda Ann Mackarness actually teaches is a masterclass in silence. We'll discover the two topics ladies must never mention. We'll witness the slang apocalypse of the 1880s, where words like awfully and stunning threatened the very foundations of the English language itself. We'll enter the post-dinner drawing room where ladies could only discuss servants, babies and scandal. From the unruly member that requires constant restraint to the heavy reckoning demanded for idle words, this is Victorian feminine conversation in all its terrified, tongue-tied glory. Matilda Ann Mackarness was born Matilda Ann Planch on 23rd of November 1825 into London's theatrical and literary world. Her father was James Robinson Planch, a celebrated playwright and Somerset Herald. Her mother, Elizabeth St. George, was also a dramatist. Writing was quite literally in her blood. From an early age, Matilda wrote novels and moral tales for children. At just 20 years old in 1845, she published Old Joliffe, which was considered a satire of Dickens' The Chimes. But her real breakthrough came in 1849 with A Trap to Catch a Sunbeam, brightly written moral tale that became a Victorian bestseller, going through 42 editions in 1882 and being translated into numerous languages, including Hindustani. On the 21st of December 1852, 27-year-old Matilda married Reverend Henry Mackarness at the Holy Trinity Church in Brompton. Her husband came from an exceptionally distinguished clerical family. His brothers became the bishops of Oxford and Argyll. The couple settled first at Drummich near Hythe in Kent and then moved to Ashneck Sandwich, where he served as a vicar. But Matilda's life was marked by profound heartbreak. She bore 11 children, 4 dying in infancy. Then on the 26th of December 1868, her husband died suddenly at just 43 years of age, leaving his widow with 7 surviving children and very slender provision. That's Victorian speak for near poverty. At 43, Matilda found herself widowed, suffering from what Victorian sources only describe as ill health. With 7 children to support, she had no choice but to return to her father's home and write for her family's survival. Her financial distress was so severe that she applied for the Royal Literary Fund, a charity for struggling writers. Yet, through poverty and whatever ailments plagued her, Matilda never stopped writing. She produced over 40 books between 1849 and 1881, writing under her own name and the pen name Susie Sunbeam. She contributed to popular periodicals, including The Girl's Own Paper. She was prolific, disciplined, and determined. The Young Lady's Book was published in 1888 by George Rutledge and Sons of Broadway, Ludgate Hill. It opens a conversation chapter with a remarkable admission. Mackarness doesn't quite know where to put this topic, so she places it among the home studies. Because surely, she writes, the study to be agreeable is an important one in every woman's education. Notice the phrasing, not the study of being intelligent or informed or interesting, it's the study to be agreeable, pleasant, palatable to others. Then she offers what sounds like encouragement. A good talker is only to be equalled by a good listener. She immediately lays down the first rule, and it's a little draconian. There is one rule of conversation which should be thoroughly impressed upon the mind, which is to remember there are 2 persons of whom you should never suffer yourself to speak. One is yourself, and the other is your enemy. The reason is evident. You run into 2 dangers, egotism and injustice. 2 forbidden topics, yourself and your enemy. You cannot mention yourself, not your experiences, nor your thoughts, nor your observations, nor your joys, because that's egotism. And you cannot mention anyone you dislike or anyone who has wronged you, because that's injustice. According to historian Sally Mitchell in her 1981 study, The Fallen Angel, Chastity, Class and Women's Reading, 1835 to 1880, conduct books for women emphasized self-effacement as a core feminine virtue. Women who spoke about themselves were considered unfeminine, vain, and socially aggressive. As Mitchell notes, the ideal woman was defined by her absence of self-assertion and in any form. This wasn't just about modesty. According to research by Mary Povey in Uneven Developments, the Ideological Work of Gender in Mid-Victorian England in 1988, the ideology of feminine self-negation served economic purposes. Women who could not assert themselves, couldn't argue their own interests, were far easier to control in marriage settlements, property disputes, and family economics. But Mackarness isn't finished. She continues. Women are too justly accused of a love of scandal, and in groups of ladies collected together for a chat, it is too often happens that severe and sometimes scarcely true remarks on the conduct or motive of their neighbours form the staple of their conversation. The time passed in the drawing room after dinner, before the gentlemen join the ladies, is generally occupied by the conversation on servants and babies, or the more reprehensible animadversions I have just alluded to. Neither of these subjects is either very entertaining or very instructive. The difficulty of Willie's teething and the delinquencies of the servants are serious subjects to the mother and mistress, no doubt, but are best left at home with the morning dress. This passage is remarkable for what it reveals. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room. The gentlemen stayed at table with their port and cigars, discussing politics, business, current events, the substance of the world. The ladies retired to discuss servants and babies. And Mackarness condemns them for it. But what else did they have? According to historian Lenore Davidoff, in The Best Circles of Society Etiquette and the Season from 1973, women's post-dinner conversation topics were limited by their actual daily experiences. Middle and upper-class women's lives centred on household management and childcare. These weren't frivolous choices, these were their entire worlds. Davidoff notes that women were systematically excluded from education, in politics, economics, law and science. Their reading was censored and controlled. Their activities were confined to the domestic sphere. Then they were mocked for having nothing interesting to say. The cruelty of Mackarness's phrasing is quite striking. Neither of these subjects is either very entertaining or very instructive. She's telling women that their daily reality, managing households, raising children, is boring and worthless as a conversational material. But she does offer an alternative. The topics of the day, the new books, amusing anecdotes, pretty work, and graceful feminine occupations should form the staple of conversation. They are subjects free from danger to that unruly member which requires such constant restraint. That unruly member, the tongue, notice that it's considered safe. New books, amusing anecdotes, pretty work, nothing controversial, nothing political, nothing that requires actual opinion or analysis. Just pleasant decoration. And here's where the economics become visible. New books required money to be purchased or access to subscription libraries. According to publishing historian Simon Elliott's research in Some Patterns and Trends in British Publishing 1800 to 1919, published in 1994, a new 3-volume novel in the 1800s cost 31 shillings and sixpence, roughly £150 in modern currency. Subscription to Mudie's Select Library cost 1 guinea annually, about £100 today for access to one book at a time. Working class women earned £20 to £30 per year as domestic servants, according to economic historian Sarah Horrell's research on Victorian wages. A lady's maid earned £15 to £25 annually. The cost of accessing new books to make oneself an agreeable conversationalist was beyond the reach of most women. But Mackarness paints an idyllic picture of what proper feminine conversation could achieve. From a mind well stored with good reading, good words are almost sure to emanate, as from a pure spring flowers the bright sparkling water, and more attractive than beauty or wealth or position is the pleasant, intelligent companion whose clever and original remarks will be full of refreshment to the tired man of business on his return home, or still more to the unoccupied one who, from his ride in the park or the afternoon lounge at his club, will know that at home a bright welcome awaits him from one whose pleasant talk will refresh and amuse him, and render the evenings at home as agreeable, if not more so than those passed in society. This means the purpose of a women's conversation is to refresh tired men, to keep them home, to compete with society, which were clubs, male social spaces, and potentially other women. Women's intellectual labour, the reading, the cultivation, the careful selection of amusing anecdotes, was unpaid domestic service. According to Amanda Vickery's research in The Gentleman's Daughter, Women's Lives in Georgian England from 1998, wives' conversational skills were considered part of their marital duties, essential to keeping husbands content and faithful. The metaphor Mackarness uses is revealing. From a pure spring flows the bright, sparkling water. Women are springs, not thinking beings who generate ideas, but natural sources that flow without effort or agency, pure, bright, sparkling, and refreshing. But there was fears that the English language was deteriorating. There was a slang crisis, and Mackarness is genuinely distressed. Of late years, a very lax style of conversation has prevailed, caught from the brothers and young men friends, which is greatly to be condemned. I mean what is called slang, foolish, misapplied words which are entirely destroying to our native language and for which we really need a new dictionary. This wasn't hyperbole to Mackarness, this is linguistic apocalypse. She provides specific examples of the offending words. Awfully, which means excessively, pretty, merry, or agreeable. Stunning, a pretty bonnet or dress, well-executed picture or theatrical performance. Waxy is to be angry or irritable, etc. Cheeky, which means impertinent or bold. These words sound perfectly ordinary to modern ears. Awfully, barely registered and is informal. Stunning is complimentary, but in 1888 these are marks of moral decay. According to linguistic historian Linda Mugglestone in her 2003 study, Talking Proper, The Rise of Accent as Social Symbols. Victorian anxieties about language were fundamentally about class. New words, informal usage, and slang were associated with lower classes, with men's spheres, military, sports, commerce, and increasingly with women adopting masculine speech patterns. The Oxford English Dictionary dates awfully as an intensifier to the 1830s, showing it spreading through informal speech. Stunning, as remarkably attractive, appears from the 1840s. These weren't new coinages in 1888, they'd been in use for decades. But they remained marked as improper, and women using these were seen as transgressing class boundaries. Mackarness continues, and her anguish builds. Coins, too, have no longer their original names, and pretty rosy lips talking about giving the cabman a bob. Shades of Johnson and Walker, arise and defend the poor ill-used English language. Better was the stilted, verbose style of days gone by than this slovenly utterance of a language, which is quite full as the beauty of the much venerated Italian, when the words are so well spoken and well chosen. Shades of Johnson and Walker, she's summoning the ghosts of lexicographers Samuel Johnson and John Walker to defend the English language from the depredations of young ladies saying bob instead of shilling. The phrase pretty rosy lips, it emphasises youth, femininity, physical attractiveness, and the betrayal when those decorative lips produce slang. According to the gender historian John Tosh in A Man's Place, Masculinity and the Middle Class Home in Victorian England, 1999, women were seen as guardians of linguistic and moral purity within the home. When they adopted slang, they weren't just being informal. They were abandoning their sacred duty. But notice who Mackarness blames. This lax style was caught from brothers and young men friends. The men originated it, but the women, using it, are condemned for destroying the language. She concludes with a plea. Will not our young ladies stand up for their own mother tongue and, by speaking it in its purity, redeem its lost character? Young ladies must redeem the English language. It's their responsibility, not the brothers and the young men friends who coined the slang. It's the women who adopted it afterwards. This pattern men create and women are blamed for adopting runs throughout Victorian conduct literature. According to Nancy Armstrong's research in Desire and Domestic Fiction, A Political History of the Novel, 1987, women were positioned as guardians of culture and morality precisely because this made them responsible for controlling masculine excess, whilst denying them any authority to actually do so. But now we come to one of the most painful sections. Mackarness addresses how to train young girls in conversation. Many mothers and those who have the care of the young are apt, in my opinion, to restrain them too strictly from conversation during meals. It is better to make it a rule that they should speak only when spoken to, and then continually dress them on the subjects suited for their comprehension, encouraging them to give their own ideas of things that are daily occurring, explaining passing events, and giving an interest in what is taking place in the world around them, questioning them on the books they have read, and, in short, drawing out their minds so that conversation will be no effort to them when they go out into society. And that painful mauvaise honte which makes a girl afraid to hear the sound of her own voice will be effectually avoided. Mauvaise honte, false shame, a painful shyness that makes a girl afraid to hear the sound of her own voice. The contradiction is stunning. Girls should speak only when spoken to, but they should also be continually addressed and questioned so that conversation becomes natural to them. They need to practice speaking so that they won't be paralyzed by shyness. But they must practice in a controlled environment, where they can only respond to others' prompts, but never initiate. According to Carol Dyehouse's research, Girls Growing Up in Victorian and Edwardian England from 1981, girls' education emphasized obedience and self-suppression. Governesses trained girls to speak when addressed, answer questions correctly, and avoid drawing attention to themselves. The goal was producing women who could participate in social life without asserting themselves. But this training often produced exactly what Mackarness describes: women so terrified of speaking that they became social failures. And then she gives us an example. I heard once of a gentleman entirely foiled by a young lady to whom he had been trying to make himself agreeable, but whose power of conversation had certainly not been cultivated. For on his repeating a sentence to which she had made no reply, and which, of course, he presumed she had not heard, she merely vouchsafed the answer in a grave monotone, "So you said." Signally defeated in his amiable efforts, he retired and gave himself no further trouble to entertain this most reticent young lady. "So you said." That's all she could manage. The gentleman repeated himself, thinking he hadn't been heard. She had heard, she just couldn't think of any response that was both proper and interesting, so she acknowledged his repetition with the only phrase that came to mind. Or she was so painfully bored and dying to get rid of him that "so you said" was a good response to end the conversation. This is a little sad. There is a young woman, trained from childhood to speak only when spoken to, taught that mentioning herself is egotism, told that most topics are unsuitable, commanded to avoid slang, expected to be pleasant and refreshing like a pure spring, and when a gentleman tries to engage her in conversation, she's so paralysed by rules or painfully bored, and training can only produce a couple of words in a grave monotone. The problem is here she had failed the essential test. She cannot be agreeable. Her training has worked too well, or not well enough. According to the historian Martha Vicinus, in Independent Women, Work and Community for Single Women, 1850 to 1920, published in 1985, the emphasis on feminine silence as self-suppression created a generation of women who struggled to function in social or professional contexts. The qualities that made a woman proper often made her useless in any role requiring initiative, opinion, or self-advocacy. There is a deeper layer to all of this, Mackarness writes. Having fully impressed yourselves with the first rule I have laid down in respecting the two subjects of conversation to be avoided, I would suggest that you should remember never to talk too fast or too loud, and that the words we say are heard and registered for all and against us. Let us beware of those idle words for which a heavy reckoning will be demanded. This is surveillance language. Someone is keeping track, someone is recording, someone is watching you. And then a heavenly reckoning will be demanded. This isn't just social judgment, it's divine judgment. In a book of this kind, it would be quite out of place to go into the serious portion of this subject, but I would recommend to my young readers an admirable work by Goulburn called The Idle Word, which will show them clearly what words will come under the denomination and how to avoid them. Edward Merrick Goulburn, Thoughts on Personal Religion, 1862, contains the sermon, The Idle Word, based on Matthew 12:36. But I say unto you that every idle word that man shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. Every idle word recorded to be accounted for on Judgment Day. According to the religious historian Callum Brown in The Death of Christian Britain 2001, Victorian religious culture emphasised women's spiritual responsibility for household morality. Women were seen as naturally more pious, more morally sensitive, more accountable to God. Their speech was not just a social performance, it was a spiritual test. This added another crushing layer to all of the other rules. It wasn't enough to avoid social censure, you had to avoid divine punishment as well. Every careless word, every slip into slang, every moment you forgot yourself and mentioned your own experiences, all of it was being recorded for judgment. The surveillance was external, society watching, judging, and condemning. And it was internal, your own conscience, trained to hear God's voice in every rule of conduct literature. Mackarness herself exemplifies the impossibility of the standard. Here was a woman who had to speak through writing to survive. After her husband's death, her ability to produce words, thousands and thousands of words, 40 books worth of them, kept her 7 children from starvation. She couldn't afford to be silent. She couldn't afford to worry whether discussing her own hardships constituted egotism. She had to write, to publish, to sell her words. And yet she was teaching girls that mentioning themselves was forbidden, that their conversation should flow like pure spring, natural, effortless, refreshing, while requiring nothing for themselves. This contradiction tells us everything about the bind Victorian women inhabited. Those with resources were taught to be decoratively pleasant while suppressing themselves. Those without resources had to violate every rule of feminine self-effacement to survive. And both groups were judged. The silent decorative ones for being boring and having nothing to say. The speaking ones for being unfeminine, aggressive, improper. There was no winning position. The rules themselves ensured failure. I'm going to return to that image of the unruly member, the tongue requiring constant restraint. Victorian medical literature was obsessed with the women's bodies requiring management. The womb was wandering, the nerves were hysterical, the reproductive system was constantly threatening to overwhelm reason. According to medical historian Elaine Showalter in The Female Malady, Women's Madness in English Culture in 1830 to 1980, which was published in 1985, Victorian medicine positioned women's bodies as a fundamentally unstable, requiring external control. The tongue fits this pattern perfectly. It's unruly. It threatens to speak forbidden topics, the self, the enemy. It might produce slang, corrupting the pure mother tongue. It requires constant management, constant surveillance, constant correction. Women's speech, like women's bodies, could not be trusted. Both needs rules, regulation, guidance from authorities, male doctors for the body, male-approved conduct for literature and for the tongue. But here's what's remarkable. The rules for conversation that Mackarness lays out, these are actually quite useful for marginalised groups trying to survive in hostile spaces. Not mentioning yourself protects you from ridicule. Listening carefully helps you navigate danger. And being pleasant makes powerful people less threatened by you. Avoiding controversy keeps you safe. These weren't just arbitrary feminine requirements, they were also survival strategies for people without power. The tragedy is that they were taught as a natural feminine virtue, rather than as tactics for navigating subordination. And they were enforced with such rigidity that they often backfired, producing women too terrified to speak at all. The irony of Mackarness's own life hangs over this entire text. She couldn't afford to speak only when spoken to. When her husband died and left her in poverty with 7 children, she had to speak loudly and persistently, through all her books, through the periodicals, through whatever writing she could sell. She had to mention herself constantly. Every application to the Royal Literary Fund required her to detail her own hardships, her own needs, her own circumstances. Every negotiation with publishers required her to advocate for herself. She had to have the Unruly member. That's what kept her alive. And yet she taught young ladies to find their tongues, to be pure springs flowering effortlessly for others' refreshment, to fear the heavy reckoning that would come from idle words. Perhaps she was trying to spare them the necessity she faced. Perhaps she genuinely believed that women with proper husbands and adequate resources should cultivate this restrained, decorative speech. Perhaps she was simply writing what sold, giving anxious mothers what they wanted to hear about training daughters for marriage. Or perhaps, under the cloak of what was acceptable to be published, she was handing over the rules that would allow young ladies to work the system successfully for their own protection and to gain in a world where women had no power at all. We've come rather far from a world where awfully threatened civilization. We can say stunning without summoning the shades of Johnson and Walker, and we can mention ourselves in conversation without being condemned for egotism. We can discuss topics beyond pretty work and amusing anecdotes, but the legacy of that training persists in subtle ways. Women are still interrupted more than men in professional settings. Women's contributions in meetings are still overlooked until a man repeats them. Women who assert themselves are still called aggressive, while men displaying identical behaviour are called confident. The unruly member is still being policed, just a little more quietly now. Matilda Ann Mackarness died in 1881, having spent her widowhood writing constantly to support her children. The young lady's book was republished repeatedly throughout the 1890s, teaching a new generation that their tongues required constant restraint. One wonders what Mackarness would have made of women who speak publicly now. Women in Parliament, women on television, women writing under their own names without apology. Would she be horrified at the loss of feminine restraint? Or would she be proud of us, seeing that we finally found our freedom? Sadly, we'll never know. But we have her book and her history with all its contradictions intact. A woman who had to speak, teaching women to be silent. A woman who supported herself through words, telling women their words were dangerous. A woman who survived by breaking every rule she prescribed. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the young lady's book. The fact that the woman writing them had already discovered the rules were impossible to follow, and she survived them anyway. Until next time, may you never have to wrangle your tongue to silence. May your slang never corrupt the entire English language, and may you never say anything more scandalous than, "So you said." This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening.